Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Museum of the American Indian. Central to the mission of the National Museum of the American Indian is to tell the stories of great achievements in the history, art, and culture of Native America. So in the galleries upstairs, you will see these stories, and you will learn about the historical figures central to these stories who we honor. But just as important, if not actually more important, to our mission at the National Museum of American Indian is to extend this recognition to the present day. So we have established the Native Achievers Program. This program recognizes Native American individuals whose lives and work have made a lasting difference in the arts, sciences, humanities, government, sports, and literature of today. Our first recipient was actor Wes Studi, and later this month, we will honor playwright William S. Yellowrobe Jr. This afternoon, Dr. Donald L. Fixico is a distinguished foundation professor of history at Arizona State University. He is a policy historian and an ethnohistorian, focusing his research on American Indian policy and federal Indian policy and American Indians in the 19th and 20th centuries. Dr. Fixico has authored 11 books on American Indian history, treaties, and urban Indians, and written numerous scholarly studies and publications. Dr. Fixico will be speaking about his work and especially his new book, Inside the Lodge, American Indian Oral Tradition, Myth, and Oral History. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Donald L. Fixico. Dr. Fixico, the National Museum of American Indian is honored to present you this award this afternoon, and if you don't mind, I would like to read it for the benefit of the audience. Native Achievement Award to Donald L. Fixico in recognition for exceptional contributions in the fields of history and education, presented this 10th day of April 2010, signed Kevin Gover, Director, National Museum of American Indian. Congratulations, Dr. Fixico. At this time, I would like to also introduce Mark Hirsch. Dr. Mark Hirsch is a historian with our museum scholarship group. He has his PhD in American Social History from Harvard University and his master's from the Center for Social History at the University of Warwick, England. Mark? So I invite you to sit back, enjoy this afternoon's program, and participate vigorously in the question and answer session and the discussion following this presentation. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for coming this afternoon. You're in for a very, very big treat, I think. As Justin just mentioned, I am an historian here at the museum. I consider myself something of a journeyman historian, that is somebody who's been doing this for a while, sort of thinks he knows the craft. But you are very, I think, privileged today to meet somebody who is, in fact, a master craftsman, and you'll be hearing from him very shortly. So please, if you would, give another hand to Professor Donald Fixico. After that, after his talk, though, I should say, we will be having a small interview session. I'll ask a few questions based on his remarks. And after that, I will turn the floor over to you. If you have some questions to ask Dr. Fixico, please do. And don't be shy. There are no silly questions, no bad questions. All questions are good. So on that note, I'm going to hand the stage over to Dr. Fixico. Please give him a hand. Thank you.
I think I'm supposed to sit here and talk about the slides up there, so. It really is an honor to be here, so thank you for coming on such a busy afternoon, especially on Saturday when the museum is just full of people. And I'm very grateful for the award. I lost my dad on February the 4th, and ironically, today is his birthday. And so with the award, that was really kind of unexpected, but anyway, it's a special day, and so thank you for being here. Inside the lodge is a manuscript, a book manuscript that I'm revising, and I want to be very, very careful with it. It's a part of a three-piece work in which the first work resulted in a book called The American Indian Mind in a Linear World. And that book was really an effort on my part to kind of say something for and about American Indian people like my elders, my grandparents, my aunts, uncles, that you always kind of saw in the background. And they talked in the native language. For our people, it was the Muscogee Creek and Seminole language is pretty much one. The more I thought about that was that what is the essence of that is the word itself, the spoken word. And so with the part of the title, Inside the Lodge, is within that realm or within that reality. And I hope that the third work, which I've already written, but it's always about time, trying to find time to go back and revise your work and make it better, is about American Indian history and the history discipline. So this is the second work. So when you look at this work here, this is the table of contents. I want to briefly just take over the table of contents and why that I think it might be important in the way that I've structured it. So when you do this, you start with the spoken word, and the spoken word really is alive. It empowers. It empowers the past, it empowers the present, it pulls them together, and it transcends time. It's that powerful. And so when you look at American Indian history, Native studies, Indian people in general, what I contend in this book project is that it's a way of understanding the whole effort. And the reason that I do my work, and I'm a historian, is to really do more recent or modern history because I want people to have a better understanding of how that Native people think, what they believe is important. And so in that sense, it's really kind of seen in a different perspective, seen in a certain way, taking into account the rhythms of the earth, cycles of the days, the rotations. Everything is cyclical, and everything is vision. And that stories that are told are in the oral tradition, but they're really stories about experiences, not events, in this kind of way of thinking. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that there is indeed a native way of thinking, but the Cherokees think a certain way, and the Muscogee Creek think a certain way, and the Iroquois think a certain way within that different way of thinking, a different perspective. One time there was a man, and let's call him Mr. Jones. Indeed, where I used to live about a year ago, because we moved, there was a Mr. Jones who lived across the street, and he was an engineer. So this is Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith, as this very short story goes. Mr. Jones always had everything that was better than Mr. Smith's. Better lawnmower, kids were smarter, all that. And so Mr. Smith just could not keep up with Mr. Jones. Mr. Smith one day saw the newspaper, and in the classified ad it said, "Dog walks on water for sale." And he says, "I've got to buy this dog. Jones doesn't have anything like that." And so he called the guy up, said, "Does this truly, the dog walks on water? Is he for sale?" I said, "Indeed." Went and bought the dog. So as he came home, he called Mr. Jones up and he said, "I've got something to show you." So they met in the middle of the street, and so he put the dog in the station wagon, picked up Mr. Jones, and they went out to the lake. Drove out there. As they pulled over to the side, and then Mr. Smith got the dog out of the back, and Mr. Jones got out of the car too. Mr. Smith took a stick and threw it out into the lake. The dog proudly walked out there, fetched the stick, and walked back. Mr. Smith put the dog in the car. Mr. Jones got in the car. And as they're driving away, Mr. Smith couldn't take it anymore. And he said, "Jones, didn't you know anything about that dog that was different?" And Mr. Jones replied, "Well, I realized he couldn't swim." So all of this is a different perspective. And so I'm trying to bring to you in this book project that Native people think in a very different way. And in that very different way is a very different kind of sense of reality. Things that we have to kind of assume in order to kind of open up our minds and go beyond the documentary evidence. The way that we were trained as historians is that documents make the sense. But to me, the documents also come from stories. So if you look at all of this in terms of a different point of view, a different reality, and if you notice that throughout the Earth, throughout the entire universe, things tend to revolve in cycles. They're more cyclical. Day and night, months, seasons, migration of animals, ceremonies, everything like this. And so that when you see other things, you also begin to realize that they're all about relationships. How that people are related to other things that are also that are not alive. Meadows and stones and trees and everything like that. It's all about relationships. That throughout North America, there are approximately these kind of species, but those that are closest to native people are these that you see here. And indeed, it's all about relationships. Everything is connected. So that when everything is connected, that means we're also connected to places, special places, home, homeland, home space, kind of the natural world, if you want to call it that, and also the man-made places. They're all dear to us. All dear to us because stories are about those places. Stories have to contain a place in order to make it less abstract and more tangible that we can relate to. Stories are about places involving, like in the Southwest, Taos Blue Lake, and this is an example of beauty. We all need beauty in our lives. So we have a relationship with things and also a relationship with places. If you're familiar with a book, I'd like to recommend a book to you, not one of my own, but one by Keith Basso. And Keith Basso, he's an anthropologist, and he writes about wisdom lives in places. Basso, Keith, he talks about wisdom lives in places. And he talks about such places where those certain places throughout the Apache land in Arizona, that they call to the people in the concept that he refers to as earth stalking. So that those places on the earth, they remind people about stories that originate with that sense of place. And everybody who's Apache who knows those places, they recall those places because those places will sometimes just come to them instantaneously. And they'll relate past knowledge back to those places. So those special places throughout Apache land are kind of places of reference of the past, of knowledge, and all that is. And so that when we look at stories, we also look at, and Indian people know we look at ironies of life. Coyote, there's coyote stories, I just love those coyote stories. And coyote is such a kind of an ambiguous, foolhardy animal that he's a trickster, and sometimes she's a trickster. There's even a Wile E. Coyote cartoon, but did you know that there's a Wile E. Coyote fan club? And I won't say which president, but one of our recent presidents was actually a member of that Wile E. Coyote fan club. Okay. There are more than 36 tribes who have coyote stories. And they go on and on and on, but sometimes it's coyote ourselves. So coyote is the irony of life. When we don't want to say that you're wrong, we can say coyote did it, and sometimes we are coyote, maybe ourselves. If you notice in the yellow, the coyote is a species, a very adaptable animal, and has ranged that far, and it's a survivor. So coyote. Other stories that I try to cover, but other stories are about legends of warriors, great warriors of the past, but also about those warriors in which these warriors were really great orators. On your left is a picture of Tecumseh, in which we think he might have looked like. But Tecumseh, who tried to raise a massive Indian army, had to be very effective in his campaigning, oratorical abilities of the utmost he had. And so he went from different tribes to different tribes, and he spoke in his native Shawnee language, but it was passed through an interpreter who spoke in their language to that particular tribe. The other side, the other person, Chief Joseph. You know that person who delivered one of the greatest speeches that we know throughout, I think, all of Indian history and Indian studies. I will fight no more forever. So when you look at these individuals, and maybe what great speeches, I've found like 10 speeches, that I think are among the very greatest speeches ever given by Native people, Native leaders, then you would find great speeches like these throughout time, like Tecumseh, Black Hawk, Osceola, and others like this. But you know, it was also the timing and the circumstances that they spoke. So when they gave these great speeches, it was during particular times of distress, particular times when they had to rally their warriors, certain times in the case of Chief Joseph, when his people were starving to death. And then it's the individual too. So it's not just the individual that makes the great speech. Circumstances and timing as well. When you look at individuals that are very in command of the oral tradition, one of them would be Will Rogers. He's a son of Oklahoma, part Cherokee, radio commentator. Did you know that in the 1930s, he was the highest paid actor? Highest paid actor. Maybe you wouldn't know that, but he appeared in 71 movies. Unfortunately, he died in an airplane crash in the 30s, so such an individual. We don't see a Will Rogers type very often. In the book Project 2, I talk about humor. If you're an American Indian, if you're around Indian people, we have to have humor. Even when times are bad, you have to laugh about those times. And so there's humor, there's Indian to Indian jokes, things like that, we tell about other tribes. I won't tell you any of those right now because somebody who's maybe of that tribe might take offense. But off the record, we have fun doing that because other tribes have tribal jokes about other tribes. I'll tell you a real quick one. That this was about the relocation experience in the 1950s and the 1960s. And American Indians really hadn't been in cities very much. World War II had happened, 25,000 Indian men served, several hundred Indian women served in World War II. After that, the federal government said, we're going to move you to cities. But if you've never been to a city before, how would that happen? My coming to Washington, I mean, there was just throngs of people on the sidewalk today and the cherry blossom parade today. But if you'd never been to a city, and if you'd never been to a large building, and there was at one point this building called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this man who was on relocation was told to go into the building, and he asked where was the relocation office, and it was up these flight of stairs, but was told that you can take the elevator. And he asked, well, what is the elevator? And the person said, well, it's right over there. And he said, well, where is it? And the person said, it's right over there. Just go over there, stand by that door, and push that button. So this Indian person slowly walked over to this door, saw the button, and this person wearing a trench coat briefcase just rushed right past him in a very hurry, almost knocked him over. And he pushed the button, and the doors began to open in the small room, and the man jumped inside, and he wanted to hurry, and so he pushed another button and hurried close before the Indian person could get in. The Indian person kind of stood there and wondered, well, boy, he was in a hurry. Some lights flickered above the door. Dot, 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 dot. Dot, 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 dot. And the doors opened again, and a woman walked out. So what? But if you'd never seen an elevator work before, and a man walks in there, he pushed the button, and then something happens, and the doors open again, and a woman steps out. I don't think I'm going to step into that room. So Indians tell a joke about other Indians, and you know how that we experienced making phone calls for the first time, traffic lights for the first time in the 1950s and 1960s and things like that. That some of these stories also cover the metaphysical, ghosts and spirits, a lot of them. Believe me, I grew up with a lot of these things, and so very much the metaphysical is a part of us. That the prophecies are a part of this too, about the longhouse with the Iroquois, the white buffalo woman, how that we should live and how that we should conform our lives to believing in a greater power. And so there's many prophecies about that. But the important points I want to leave you with, and then as we get into the question and answer period, is that indeed oral tradition is within a reality of its own. Not to say that only American Indians have this kind of reality, but everybody who has a sense of telling stories, you live in that kind of reality. In our household at home, we could get up in the morning when we would visit. You would have a meal, a breakfast, and you would tell stories and tell stories about somebody, something else that happened, and all of them are about experiences. And you look at your watch and all of a sudden it's noontime. Have lunch and tell more stories. And so these stories are really kind of the social fabric, the cultural fabric of collective society. But these stories are indeed about experiences, not events. Because when an event, which is actually an experience, and we tend to personalize it through stories, that's what we remember most. If you teach history, and your students they dislike history because of the events, having to memorize everything, teach them to personalize the event, and they'll remember it much easier. That oral tradition also shapes cultures among American Indians, the different tribes. It gives us our identity, tells us who we are, and also defines our relationships with everything altogether.
That's great. Well, thank you, Dr. Fixico. That was fascinating. The nice thing about working here is that I was able to get a draft of Professor Fixico's manuscript, which will be published and will be in book form, but it's kind of a treat to see it in this sort of unformed state, I guess you could say, or semi-polished state. And one of the things I was really fascinated with in the book was the way that stories play such a role in Native life. This oral tradition that you talk about is so multifaceted and so obvious when you take in all the documentation. It's clear that this is a real tradition. It's a tradition that continues. I think that's probably your main argument, that this oral tradition continues. And one thing that I found really ironic, and you actually point out, is that contrary to the stereotype of Native people as being very stoic and very quiet, you have this other reality of Native people telling their stories to one another, to their families. How do you account for that distinction that people have? And on the one hand, non-natives saying, oh, well, Native people are very stoic and they don't talk very much. And this other reality where you have this vibrant oral tradition that has lasted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. What gives force and life to that stereotype, I guess, is my question.
Well, it's something that has to be negotiated, because if you can imagine yourself going to a foreign country, you go to a foreign country and then you begin to watch and pick up on what the other people do in that foreign country. If you go to Japan, for example, they always wash their hands first before they eat, which is, very proper, their etiquette and everything. But for Native people who are close to their traditions, in living in the American mainstream, they had to negotiate that in that learning about the other side and the proper way of doing things. So it's like two different countries and two different cultures. When a Native person, as I was telling about the elevator story, if you didn't ever see an elevator in action, then you have to kind of negotiate that and learn that at the same time. So it's not just a person who is a person of a different color that is kind of visiting the American mainstream. If the person is closer to their traditions, they're going to be bringing that sense of reality and that sense of value, that sense of decision making, that sense of ethos with them as they interact with the American mainstream. And the interesting part is that when they go home, then they enter back into their own kind of Native reality of the way that they were brought up and raised. And so it's very much that. But as a person tries to negotiate that, and they tend to pause, because it's a polite thing out of respect, is to pause before you speak, and you let the person finish speaking all that. That's not a part of the American mainstream. And so if there are 34 stereotypes about American Indians, 34 stereotypes that are negative. There are 6 that are favorable, and there are 6 more that are kind of neutral. So if you think about the sheer number of stereotypes, well, where does that come from? It comes from assumptions and presumptions about Indian people. A very good book is, it's kind of a classic, it's Robert Burkhofer Jr.'s the white man's Indian. And so through the stereotypes and through the past history and wars and so forth, the white man's society has rendered an identity for all of Native people categorically being one. And so that's why the stereotypes and the silent Indian is a stereotype that's kind of evolved from that type of relationship.
Right. You touched on this before, and I'd like to follow it up. And it has to do with historians and how historians do their work. What would you say to somebody who said, well, you know, talk is kind of cheap and stories are very subjective, and if you really want to write history, the only way to write history is to go to the written documents. Is there any defense of that position? How would a Native person respond to that, somebody who is steeped in oral traditions, the oral traditions of their people?
Mark, that's a tough question. And it's a tough question because most of us trained as historians, it's always the evidence, the physical evidence in the documents. Well, true, we work with those documents as historians. That's a part of our craft. It's like the nails that we use as a carpenter.
Right.
But it's also those documents, what are they based on? They're also based on stories. And so the very documents, whether it be the Declaration of Independence, well, what is that? It has a story in it. As the Declaration of Independence, as a document, or maybe the Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta and everything, they're all about stories. And so I think as historians, we tend to forget that those documents are actually about something important, but there needs to be something about it. And that's why our children have a difficult time in school trying to know those things, because the story has been lost about those documents, as important as they are. So yes, historians, we believe in empirical evidence, and that's the document in hand, that's the actual legislation or the Indian Treaty or something like that. But each one of those has a story and experience, and each of them has a life energy of its own, and I think we've forgotten about that. For a historian, as myself, I mean, when I hold a document, and I've been allowed to do this, that Thomas Jefferson has signed or something like that, you know, there's a chill that kind of, indeed, and you think, you know, Thomas Jefferson actually held this document, actually signed it, and you know, he wasn't that great of a speller. So, but then you realize that this is something that he touched, and I'm touching too. I'm allowed to touch that many hundreds of years ago.
And there's absolutely no reason to believe that oral traditions are any less exciting. I mean, they're the same. They tell stories. They tell them. Those stories are told verbally and over many generations, but they're no less legitimate and no less exciting than that document that Jefferson may have signed. Let me go back to something, and this goes to the sort of the origins of the research for this forthcoming book. Did you have any sort of set ideas about Native oral tradition when you started, and did you find anything in the course of your research that really challenged your own ideas about this tradition, its shape, its durability, its how oral tradition may have changed over time? Did you find any surprises, I guess is what I'm saying?
Well, I think so, Mark, because I've found that as a trained historian in the Western academic way, I'm always challenged. I don't think like most academics coming from Western society, as I've tried to say, that an American Indian mind in a linear world is actually how a lot of Native people think. What I've also found, too, is a lot of artists think the same way. A lot of musicians think the same way, too. Very cyclical, very vision-oriented. And so what's hard for people like us to do, and I'm putting artists and musicians in that group, too, is to learn the Western way of thinking in a very linear fashion. When I first began teaching as a young assistant professor, in the old days when we had blackboards, you know, now we don't have blackboards, but I wrote something in the very middle of the blackboard, and this was about Calvin Coolidge. Trying to make Calvin Coolidge interesting at 4:30 in the afternoon, and nobody wants to be in that class. I don't want to be there either, and you're trying to do your best to make Calvin Coolidge interesting. And a young lady shot up her hand, and she said, "Professor Fixico, why do you write in the middle of the board? Why don't you write up in the upper left-hand corner and go down? And then when you say something again, start a second row and go down." And it was there that I began to realize that I approach things by putting things right in the middle of the blackboard, because it's so central. You put it right in the middle, and other things that are related to it, and they would relate, like spokes on a wheel, to that very central idea so that you wouldn't confuse it. But to her and to the rest of the students, I began to realize they weren't getting my point that I was trying to get across, and I was the teacher, I was the professor. So there was a clash of different points of view and different ways of learning. So you can imagine my teaching evaluations really just sucked, as they say.
Graduate school must have been tough. It's tough for everybody, you know,
Yeah.
especially tough. Your book covers a huge range of subjects, origin stories and speeches, prophecies, visions. Is there a favorite story that you would like to tell, something that you didn't know about before, or just something that you've begun to rethink as a result of having put this material together in a manuscript? Is there any one favorite story that you think is really telling about Native American orality?
Well, the one that I think of is actually in the last chapter, and I think I put 3 in the last chapter, and I formed the last chapter for personal reasons, because I thought, you know, I grew up with stories. They were the social fabric of our family, and I think of many of the Muscogee Seminoles and Muscogee Creeks and Seminoles, and a lot of Native people too, and really not Native people who are Indians, but people just in general. I mean, Appalachians and Texans and people in Minnesota, you know, we all have our stories in a very local way. But one that makes me realize that inside of the lodge and the reality and what Indian life is really like, and the sense of spirituality and power of it is like in this story, and this is a very short version of it. My dad and our neighbor who was not Indian, he was a white guy. He was a bricklayer. My dad worked in construction. These 2 young men are out hunting, decide to hunt, so they come back from work, and they're going out hunting, told the wives that. Kids don't get to go along, so I had to stay at home that time. And so as they were off hunting, and it began to get dark, then they said to each other, well, we need to hurry and get home because it's getting dark. They haven't had dinner yet. And so as they were coming back to the car, Carl, the bricklayer, he turned and stopped and he faced my dad. And he said, and he asked, John, did you hear that? And my dad kind of nodded. And so Carl then turned, and so they started hurrying a little bit faster towards the car. And this time he grabbed my dad by the arm and he said, John, did you hear it again? And my dad turned and looked at him and just kind of nodded, and he said, we better hurry and get to the car. These 2 young men, carrying their rifles, trotting, hurried and got into the car and began to leave. Carl then asked, John, there must be some Indians around here. And my dad slowly nodded. Yeah, I guess there is. My dad knew there were no Indians around there. He knew that there were no stomp grounds around there. But what Carl heard, and what my dad heard too, was an ancient fire. An ancient fire where Indians did dance at one time. And that at the closing of the day, where the dark and the light meet twice, in the evening and in the morning, it's a very powerful time. And so white guys aren't supposed to hear things like this. But whatever it was so ancient, was also so very powerful in the earth itself. And it allowed and wanted to be heard. My dad could hear it, but he thought only he could hear it. But it was so powerful and so ancient that it allowed itself to be heard too by our white bricklayer neighbor who lived next door.
When you teach your students about this kind of thing, what kind of reaction do you get from non-native students? Do they accept it? Do they look very skeptically at this sort of spiritual world that you're talking about? At the stories, for instance, the story that you just told, do they look at it and just say that's just a bunch of hooey?
At first, many of them do, but then I challenged them too, because I heard a story about this guy who was walking in the desert and he ran into a bush, and the bush started burning, and started talking to him, and he's thinking, isn't that just the silliest story you ever heard? And then they start thinking, wait a second, that's in the Bible. And I think, well, is it? Well, that must be a very interesting story. Then I asked him, well, have you ever been to a haunted house? And they might say, well, no. But the student sitting next to them starts nodding their head yes. And so sometimes I ask that person, well, where is this house? And then all of a sudden their friend believes in this stuff and ghosts and all that stuff too. And so there's stories about that. So then they begin to realize that it's not just an Indian thing, but spirituality, ghosts, and stories about them crosses cultures and generations and crosses time too. It's just that we are so empirical minded in our crushing of data and numbers that precludes us from even thinking in those directions. But the most difficult questions, if we're going to solve them in the future, questions that not even been conceived of, that are going to cause trouble for this world and maybe for this universe, we've got to come up with the most imaginary and most innovative ways of thinking. If there's a problem or if there's a question and you think about it from the same direction, the same approach, you're going to be limited in the possibilities of solving that problem. So why not open up other opportunities? When you get into, for example, into theoretical physics, I mean, they talk about the non-tangibles, and how do they do that? Well, they have to accept and assume certain things. For example, how do you know there's a black hole? What evidence is there? But scientists have resolved that the black hole makes sounds. So how do they know that? So we have to kind of trust our thinking and our instincts and not just deal with the empirical evidence and say that's the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, right. One of the things I find really interesting about your work and the questions that you're asking is clearly there is an oral tradition that is very complicated and a very long standing. One of the things that I find astounding is the resilience of these stories and prophecies and ways of looking at the world. A resilience that somehow has really faced a variety of challenges. You know, you could list all the things that have happened since contact with non-native people: colonialism, war, population decline, land loss. You know, in the 20th century, something that you were mentioning, I guess the migration from reservation communities into cities, you know, the emergence of mass culture, Facebook, you know, it goes on, and yet the argument I think you're making is these traditions and these stories continue, and I guess my question is, how is it possible that these stories could have such resilience against these enormously powerful forces?
Those forces also carry stories with them too. All of us have stories about Facebook, horror stories, exciting stories, silly stories, funny stories, things like that. But stories are manufactured and made, but stories are also carried from the past to the present. Mm-hmm. And they have a life energy about them, I'm sure, because when a story is told, it's almost as if that past comes to the present and it's alive. When a person who is a very good experienced storyteller, and you also have to be an experienced listener too. We somehow have Indian people say, well, did you bring your ears today? Well, a lot of times people don't bring their ears to classrooms and things like that, and that's the hardest. But in the hands of a great storyteller like Tiata of the Chickasaw people, for example, and she's quite well known, or Will Rogers, then they tell these stories, and these stories are captivating. They captivate the people because the people then can actually see these stories in their mind. And if you can do that, teaching your kids while they're young and everything, they'll always remember those times. It's something that is so elemental, stories are, and it's something that's very elemental, will always kind of stay with us no matter how old we are. It keeps us young too.
And so you feel that tradition is going to continue and is safe in the 21st century, that people are still telling stories, even though they're not living perhaps in the same reservation communities anymore. Some are living in cities. Many are living in cities.
Yes, Mark, but at the same time, Native people have learned to reinvent themselves within generations into the next generation. And how is it that now, for example, I'm from the Southwest, I live in the Southwest now, pickups, play a very important role. I mean, we have a pickup in our household. bought it for $1,000. So it's not a great pickup. But pickups, for example, are very much a part of the Navajo culture in the Southwest. So how did that happen? So the Navajo people reinvented themselves, and so they brought the pickup into their culture. The same thing with the horse, the gun, etc. Native people, in being very adaptable, have had to adapt and readjust, and have systems and infrastructures that are flexible enough to reinvent themselves according to the times that they live in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Morris Foster, an anthropologist, writes a book called Being Comanche. And the Comanches are whoever they want to be. And if you understand Comanche power in the 1840s, the interesting part about them is about 40% of their population was not Comanche. But the Comanches were so powerful that they raided Mexicans, Texans, other tribes, and they incorporated them. But each time they did, they had to reinvent themselves, mm-hmm. With each generation. And that's still going on.
That's great. I think at this point, maybe we want to turn this over to the audience. If you have any questions to ask of Professor Fixico about his work or anything else that you heard today, please just raise your hand and speak right on up. Sir.
The issue of reverence for life. The Western cultures give a lot of lip service to it, but then really basically don't pay any attention to it. They have to slaughter animals and go to war and this and that. As I understand it, Native American organization alluded to it, that they have a reverence for nature. And for example, if you kill a deer, you apologize to the deer and you give thanks to the deer for whatever. But that only goes part of the way toward reverence for life. If you really, where are you on that spectrum? Because after all, you're not vegetarian, you're still killing the deer. So can you elaborate a little bit on what the Native American position is on reverence for life?
Well, in general, but then of course different Indian groups have their own beliefs in very certain ways. But let me say two things about that. One of them is, and if you understand, if we can accept that, everything is about relationships. And so the relationships, we are all related. Some of the scientists, theoretical physicists, are talking about string theories. They're talking about the M theory too, how that, and something like a toe theory, a theory of everything. Everything is connected. But for Native people, and I'm working with a concept called natural democracy. And natural democracy goes like this, that if everything that is in existence is simply acknowledged and recognized for what it is, then it exists out of the basis of just respect. Even if it's an ant, or if it's a tree, something else. Just to acknowledge it, that it exists and that it's there, and that we should have just respect because it has a place and a role and perhaps a responsibility. That's what natural democracy is about. But animals, and even non-animals, have a deeper relationship according to the infrastructure of whatever tribal group that you're thinking about dealing with, studying, for example. Among my people, the Muscogee Creeks, which also evolved out of that, the Seminole people, because the Seminoles were an offshoot of the Creeks, we had something like 28 clans, 28 groups. I'm Fox. So if you have a clan affiliation, my son is Wolf, my son is adopted. So if you have a clan affiliation, then that means that that animal, that particular animal, is more important to you because you're a part of that animal. Your people of the same clan have studied that animal for centuries. And so that a wolf person and of a different tribe, and that is a wolf person, they immediately connect because they both act and know the wolf for its strengths and its weaknesses. Therefore, we have a strong reverence for that particular animal because we know so much about it. And so that same kind of earth knowledge is applied to not just animals, but all the flora and fauna. And so I think that's why. That's one of the reasons in a very broad way of maybe a greater respect for the animals and the non-animals.
Gentleman in the back.
I'm wondering how the loss of native languages may have affected the oral history tradition of Funga.
Tremendously, and I'm glad you asked that because when the languages are lost with each generation, We are rapidly losing native languages. We are rapidly losing indigenous languages around the world. It's speeding against us, certainly American Indians, because with each generation, they say something like that: when an elder dies, then a library dies. When my father passed away on February the 4th, he taught language classes. Not only do you teach language classes, but the way that you understand things through language. And something that is in the Creek language may sound funny, and it is funny, but when it's translated, it loses the humor in it. So when the language is lost, when an elder dies, and if they're a speaker of the language, then that part of the culture has been lost. And you count that enough with enough elders in a certain generation, that's an enormous loss. So how can we get back to it? And I think part of it is reinvention. But, you know, in our society, and Native people have begun to think about this too, as they get closer to the American mainstream, then they become more like the mainstream and something else gets reinvented. When we gain something, we need to also learn to look back and see what we lost. So when we actually progress, progress goes like this: true progress. Progress, 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 regress. Progress, 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 regress. Not everything is smooth in achieving the American dream, is it? So we should turn around sometimes and look backwards and see what we've lost. And we've lost a great deal, you're right. About when the language goes, so much of the decision-making, the ethos goes with it too. And that's kind of the behind of the loss of language, are just those spoken words, but it's much more than that.
So, gentleman in the middle there?
Yeah, hi. I would like to ask a question about historic preservation in terms of using federal law to preserve places that are historic significance. I'm an Indian lawyer, and had something to do with the National Historic Preservation Act, which among other things also has the creation of tribal historic preservation offices. Under the federal law, oral tradition does get figured into the picture, and tribal people and cultural anthropologists and ethnographers and help document this stuff, get their voices get to be heard as part of the discussion. But what I perceive is that the stories, while they get to be heard, the dominant culture doesn't take them as seriously as they should. And it's been my hope that through historic preservation, we actually use tribal stories to preserve places that have significance in tribal cultures and religion. And I'd just like to know some of your thoughts about what you're saying.
Well, I think too that we may not realize it, but in society in general, we're moving more towards visuality and more in terms of thinking in cycles. Many of our students tend to be repetitive in their writing. I find this so easily because I write repetitively. And you have to kind of iron those things out. Yes, yes. But why do we do that? Because we write in a very cyclical way so that we don't forget. And if we move from one point to another point, then we forgot maybe from where we started. But our society is becoming more visual oriented with DVDs and computer games and all of that too. And all of those are based on stories. So indeed, somehow, and maybe we are doing it a different way digitally, that we're documenting those kind of happenings, those kind of experiences. And maybe that will become the future. More like digital libraries and visual libraries of documentaries. Children in junior high school, you can teach them much more through a documentary than you can in a textbook. I'm trying to get the kids to read nowadays. It's just like pulling elephant's teeth. It's just too hard. But if you show them something visually, then they can personalize it. And I think if they can personalize knowledge, then they can provide ownership to it, and it kind of stays up here a little bit longer.
Lady in the front.
Rock art and other things like that are symbols. And symbols are of the past and things that are important. But when something like that is symbolized, then obviously it had some type of historical importance of the past. But unfortunately, if we lose the stories that go with it, then we've lost a great deal. We've lost that connection. One of the things that Native people fear one of the things that Native people fear is losing the connection. When we get disconnected from our own people, when we get disconnected from our past, and trying to maintain that connection through time and through the generations. When the rock art is there and we've lost that connection, it's like this. Then we're trying to find that connection and trying to reinvent ourselves enough and using everything that we possibly can, finding people who know the stories so we can establish that reconnection again with the rock art. And that's what we need to do. As more people are dying out and losing the languages, then we're losing that faster and faster. So now I think even the tribes, they have, you have an emergence right now of revitalization of language classes and revitalization of culture, cultural preservation officers on reservations for communities and things like that. So it's all really kind of a mighty effort by tribes. The Pequots, for example, in Mashantucket, in Connecticut, are really trying to reconnect with the past. And as they try to do that, it might not quite be that way, but it might be like that. And so that they're trying very hard until they become like that, trying to establish that connection. But when we lose connection, then for that moment in time, we are not who we are.
Any other question? This gentleman in the front?
Language to me enables a person to conceptualize differently, not simply to say a word in a language that can be interpreted in English. Conceptualization has to do with understanding the lifestyle of the book. That to me seems to be a challenge in teaching language. As you observe across the country with different traditions, groups of people based on their own customs trying to do that, where do you see that coming?
It's difficult to do because sometimes I find myself caught in a situation where I can't explain it anymore in English. But let me use a specific example. In the Creek language, we have a term. It's actually two terms together. It's called Funga. Funga, and Funga is the totality of everything. How can you say it better so that it's more inclusive than that? Funga. If you think about that, everything in existence within something. Funga. What is that? You see where the language in English, all of a sudden, it has to, the English language itself has to stretch and even work harder in order to even conceptualize Funga from a Creek way of thinking into an English way of thinking and of acceptance of it. So immediately the barriers go up, but if the barriers are open, the doors are open, and trying to cross over that bridge of cultural kind of misunderstanding, how do you reconceptualize Funga so that somebody from the Western society can actually embrace that and realize what that is? And we Creeks, we've kind of accepted what Funga is, but we're still not quite for sure what it is, but it's everything that is encompassed within that. And that's one of the more powerful concepts that we have that, you know, we try to understand and we keep trying to understand. That's why everything is connected, because everything is within that is connected.
This gentleman in front?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about Tecumseh, if I could. Does it seem that he varied his rhetorical approach depending on which people he was talking to, whether it be a different native people or a European or a Western audience? And if he did that, where would he have acquired the background knowledge to be able to do that?
Tecumseh was Coyote. Meaning, Tecumseh was really very smart. Well, how smart is smart? Smart is measured in a very comparative way. And in a very comparative way, he was compared with William Henry Harrison. And for those two individuals, as they grappled and their minds went against each other, it was like two grand chess masters outmaneuvering each other at the same time. Well, in order to be of that magnitude, then you had to have great oratorical ability and looking ahead. Both of them were looking ahead and playing this game of chess for the Ohio country. And it was a grand game. Tecumseh used rhetoric in a very effective way against his brother, who was empowered in a certain way medicinally and all of that too. And Tecumseh himself, when he used it to preach to the people, the native people who already were on his side, but preaching or talking to and giving the greatest speeches he could to the Choctaws who didn't trust him and who didn't follow, his beliefs. So Tecumseh was much more than rhetorical. He used rhetoric, but at the same time, he used strategy and everything that he could possibly have in doing that. He was a very wise person at a very young age. He saw death many times to his father, his brothers, who their lives had been taken in war, and he learned from all of that. The greatest teacher is life experiences, and he learned the taking of life when his family members lost their lives in trying to stop Western expansion by the white race. And so he employed all of those things that he learned, but I think that his medicine also, too, was great. His medicine, and that's what we believe, and that's just part of this book, is that it's an earth knowledge and much more than that. It's obtaining the metaphysical reality with the physical reality. And if you can combine that and open your mind to the other side of life, to the metaphysical side, you may very well indeed be endowed with those powers from whatever it was if you pray. For example, if you needed to make a great speech, maybe like today, you might make a prayer so that it could happen. It would happen on the battlefield and those things like that. So I'm positive that he was asking for that type of help.
Any other questions from the audience?
I had a question. I have worked with the Navajo and Hopi children in the class who were part of Elder House, where we were 2 weeks at a time in the class with children. And the thing that came up, children, is that they were speaking English. And the parents evidently weren't trying to keep them speaking Navajo. And I often wonder, what happened? It's just been 8 years now, and I was going to go back, but in the 5-6 years that I was there, gradually they were getting away from the Navajo language. And this is on the reservation where Flagstaff was the only town they'd ever been to, never been down to Phoenix. I wonder whether you have been in touch with anybody like that.
I have quite a few Navajos in my students. At Arizona State, we have, out of a student population of like 51,000, almost 52,000 students on campus, about 1,400 of them, 1,500 are Indian students. And the majority of them are Navajo students. So you see Navajo students, quite frequently, but 1,400 compared to 51,000, that's really a very small fraction. What you do see in the classroom is, them practicing and learning the ways of Western society and trying to do as well as they can in that way. And so if they come from a pure Navajo way and they're taking on the teachings and learning of the Western way of thinking, then what they're doing is recreating something in the middle. And as they create this kind of third entity, like a trichotomy, if this is a dichotomy, and this is a trichotomy that's beginning to form, well, at some point, the trichotomy will cause confusion and some difficulty, and I think this is what they're kind of going through. The grades will dip, they'll not do as well. I speak from personal experiences too, that then they're going to have to, at least at some point, gain confidence in doing well in the mainstream, and in that process of doing that well and retaining this Navajoism, then they may very well create this trichotomy that then begins to become so important and so evident, then that becomes a dichotomy. And my example is the urban Indian population. 2/3 of the Indian population lives in urban areas, in non-rural areas. So when you look at American Indians, most of them don't live on reservations. Almost 300 reservations, 301 reservations. They live in urban areas. And so in a sense, they became the third dichotomy. Now they're the true dichotomy in this very kind of theoretical sense. And it's the urban Indian community that is learning and dealing with the American mainstream in that very kind of theoretical way. And they've displaced the rural and the reservation community. But it's our stereotypes from the mainstream that sees that's the real Indian community there, when that's not the majority.
I think there's a hand over there. Yes.
It really, I think, depends on how close they are to their traditions. that if they're very close to their traditions, and if they've been raised by their parents or maybe grandparents who speak their native language and everything, then they're going to be closer in the way of thinking according to their ways. Their whole sense of decision-making and sense of logic and sense of ethos and everything is going to be closer that way. Now, if you take a child who's been raised in that way, then it's like take them and say, well, trying to put them in Spain and for them to learn Spanish. Well, it's going to be a big leap for them to do that. And so I think that's what a lot of Indian children, they have that tendency of making that leap when all these kind of cultural jumps are kind of there, that hurdles that they have to overcome. Math, botany, different religious views, different behavioral actions and things like that. Mainstream teachers don't realize that those are the hurdles that Native kids are having to leap over each of those hurdles every day. But see, the interesting thing too is they have to leap over those hurdles back when they go home. So it's a continual effort of doing that when their teachers are not seeing that and they only see the performance of the kid in the classroom. So they need to take into consideration, it would be very, very good if all teachers went somewhere and lived in a foreign country for 6 months. And then they would realize that when I lived in England for a little over a year, I couldn't make a phone call. I didn't know how to make a phone call. And so those very simple things that need to be understood when you're teaching people of a different culture.
I'm afraid we have to wrap things up now, but I want to thank you all very much for coming to this session today. And I think we owe Professor Fixico a big round of applause for bringing us into the inside the lodge. Thank you very much. Thank you. Pleasure. Thanks a lot.